Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to request everybody to take their seats. We don't want to delay this session, in part also because Pranab has a flight to catch later and so needs to get out on time. Let's see, Karthik. Yeah, good. So this session is a bit of a experiment in innovation, and I have to just share how and why we are doing it. I'm very pleased to see Lance Pritchett just walk in one of the most colorful shirts I've ever seen him in. But and so Lance's going to be talking about, I think, broader issues again, but they are very related to this particular session. So this session came out of a discussion I had with Shanta Devarajan, and Shanta said, it would be very nice to do not just a paper-by-paper discussion, but something that reflects on themes running through the papers. And the obvious theme was market failure versus government failure. And we couldn't really forsake the paper-by-paper discussion, which I think all authors look forward to, because the quality of the comments they receive here are really very high, and that helps the editors greatly in actually in the revision of the papers and the publication of the final paper. But we thought we might have a last session which allows us to reflect on these papers. There is a implicit division of labor between the two primary speakers here, Karthik and Shanta. And Jai Panda is aware of this. He is just held up and will be here shortly, I think. And he'll, of course, bring a very important political perspective, which really underlies the whole question of market failure versus government failure. And the context is, of course, India, and the papers are all about India, so I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion. And it'll be a natural precursor to the evening's talk about building state capability when times are good. So I'll hand over to Pranab. Thank you.
It's on? Okay. Thank you, Shekhar. So he's already explained the purpose of this session, and the modalities. Like we'll start with Shanta first, and I'm not going to introduce them. If you want to know, if anybody here doesn't know them, there is there is a description of their work, etc., in your folder. So we'll have Shanta first, and then Karthik, and then hopefully by that time, Mr. Panda will arrive. So Shanta.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Pranab, and thanks, DG Shah, for the invitation. Has a ring to it. So let me just start by saying that when I look at the Indian economic policy broadly, and in fact, economic policy in most developing countries, there's a chain where policies initially get initiated to address some market failure. I mean, the classic example is the infant industry argument, which was invoked at this conference as well, was the argument behind import protection in India. But then what we find is that these policies end up creating government failures as well. So they get captured or they have counterproductive effects, which in turn means that they don't even solve the original market failure they were supposed to correct. And even worse, when they get captured, they create rents that accrue to some very powerful people, and that makes them much more difficult to change, the government failures. There's resistance to change. And the policy challenge that we're faced with now is trying to correct those government failures. And you can see why that's difficult when you've got very powerful interests, some of which are in government, or certainly close to government, that want to keep the distortions where they are. Now, if you look at this characterization of starting with market failures, then you end up with government failures, and then you're trying to correct government failures. These 5 papers that we've had in the India Policy Forum that range from pollution to state budgets to global value chains and services to ICT and agriculture to city growth, you might call them seemingly unrelated papers, actually fit very nicely into this framework of market failure, government failure, and corrections to government failure. And so let me just try to illustrate how they fit in that frame. Take the first paper on pollution, very nice paper. I mean, pollution is your classic market failure. That's a textbook example of a market failure where you do need government intervention to correct it. But we also know from the textbooks that the way to correct an externality like pollution is with a tax, a Pigouvian tax. That's again the textbook solution. And it's very interesting because the discussion in the paper was nowhere in the paper was any mention of a Pigouvian tax. It was all about command and control mechanisms. So we're in the business of creating government failures by not using the optimal instrument for correcting a market failure. And it's even worse because the paper documented very nicely that the particular command and control instruments that were used, like regulation of the factories and this odd even license plate plan for Delhi traffic, itself created failures within them by non-compliance. I mean, people buying 2 cars with different license plates, or the factories paying the auditors to come and audit their own factories, and therefore the data were unreliable. So you had a double whammy there, where you had the compliance, the lack of compliance. But keep in mind that even if there had been full compliance, this is clearly a second or third best policy because it was using command and control where you should have been using a tax to correct the original market failure. And then what the paper was proposing were ways of addressing these government failures. Those government failures created by using the wrong instrument. And there were some tentative attempts at correcting for them, but most of them had to do with really trying to reproduce the market mechanism. So there was a proposal to try to use cap and trade mechanisms. So you're trying to, again, in a roundabout way, go back to something like a first best correction, but it's very difficult. And that's one reason. And by now, you've come so far. It's politically very difficult too. There isn't, and this was mentioned, there isn't political support for those kinds of instruments at this point. But there, I think that's where the paper left us with some possible solutions, and I'm glad that Mr. Panda is here already, so I'd like to hear what he has to say. I mean, I think to correct these government failures, you need to build political support. It's not a technical solution that's going to get you there. And sometimes information and transparency of information can be one way of trying to build that political support. So this idea of ranking plants in terms of the degree of pollution that they emit by this 5 stars, 4 stars mechanism, and making that transparent to the rest of the world might be one way of building that political support. And there's been some experience in Indonesia, in Beijing, with this kind of publishing pollution by plants as one way of building that support. Now, similarly, on the paper on state budgets, I mean, it was interesting. The paper on state budget was more of a macro paper, if you like, looking at the extent of the magnitude of state budgets and the extent to which state deficits might create problems. But really, when we talk about public expenditures, all the time we have to ask the question, what is this public expenditure trying to do? In particular, is it being spent on public goods and correcting externalities, or for equity reasons, distributional reasons? And again, if you look at it very carefully, you find in most cases, including the Indian budget, but most budgets that I've looked at, is that very little of those public expenditures are actually used for genuine public goods. or genuine distribution. Or in fact, sometimes they're used for redistribution purposes, but they end up being a redistribution to the rich rather than to the poor. And so when you look at it that way, we have to be very careful about statements like, well, we shouldn't cut education spending, which is actually mentioned, because if education spending is actually skewed towards the non-poor, and there's evidence of that in many types of education spending, and certainly not delivering on the public goods that education could in principle, then we have to be much more agnostic about whether increases or decreases in spending are being advocated. But there's another side of that, of the budget paper, the state budget paper, that I felt was not sufficiently emphasized, which is on the revenue side. Because on the revenue side, there was, the authors were a little careful to say, well, we're not, there's always scope to increase revenues, and India's revenue to GDP ratio is relatively low. And there was no mention of the efficiency cost of taxation. I mean, and India is a country where people Ahmed and Stern have estimated the marginal cost of taxation in this country. I mean, it was back in 1980s and so on. And these were very high marginal costs. So, if it costs $1, I think I remember for $1 of tax revenue, the cost is $1.86. So if it costs you 80% more to raise $1 of revenue, then just getting the revenue to GDP ratio up is not necessarily a good thing, especially if you use those instruments that are so distorting. And I have to say, I mean, as I said, this is not just, I'm not just picking on India. I mean, we're in India, and this is the India Policy Forum, but I see this in spades in all the countries I deal with at the World Bank. And in fact, this recent hoopla in the international community about raising resources to meet the sustainable development goals, of billions to trillions or whatever, the stuff I hear about. And the whole focus is on what they call domestic revenue mobilization, which is to say, the donors have run out of money, so they're not going to give any more money. And we've decided that we need all this money for the SDGs, and so let's just tax those poor African countries some more to raise that money, without any mention of the efficiency cost of that taxation. So this is really a very important issue, and we can't lose sight of it. The paper on global value chains and services, similarly, I actually felt that it would have been useful had they laid out what was the government failure or market failure that would have led to a policy prescription at the end of the paper. And I think in the discussion that came out, that on the one hand, there may be a market failure in terms of an infant industry argument. I think Dilip challenged me to articulate that. But on the other hand, let's keep in mind that the trade system in India, as well as in many other countries, is replete with a series of government failures that have stood in the way of growth, of certainly export growth, for a long time, and including the protection that some services enjoy in this country. So if there's this tension between infant industry protection on the one hand and the government failures created by infant industry protection or other kinds of protection, maybe we should be very careful about jumping to a policy conclusion. I mean, maybe doing nothing is probably the least harmful thing we can do. And there's another issue underlying in that paper, which is, why are we talking so much about services in India? Well, one of the reasons is because manufacturing hasn't done very well. And manufacturing, certainly manufacturing employment, I think Rakesh mentioned this earlier this morning, hasn't grown anywhere near commensurate with the level of GDP growth that the country has enjoyed. And again, why is that? Well, there's a whole series of government failures that are standing in the way of manufacturing growth. The labor regulations, the land regulations have impeded manufacturing growth, and there's evidence behind that, including things I've read in the India Policy Forum. And so we also have to understand that the reason we're talking about services so much is also underlying it a government failure that has led us to this situation. And keep in mind that the gains from trying to correct some of those government failures can be humongous if we can get over the political difficulties. Then I think the paper on agriculture and ICTs is another textbook example, right? Because why is there so much concern about agricultural productivity in India? Well, and why is there so concern about how farmers are using too much fertilizer? Well, because the price of fertilizer is so low. They're subsidized. And in fact, we heard, we hear a lot about how the fertilizer subsidy is costing so much. It's very costly to the budget. Yeah, but it's also just misallocating the use of inputs. And not only the fertilizer subsidy, but then you also have in the southern states, the free power to farmers and all sorts of other subsidies that completely distort the input mix that farmers use. And that in turn undermines the productivity. So, so we have this huge government failure. And by the way, the fertilizer is a good example too, where there was a market failure back in the 1950s or whenever they were introduced, which was that this was considered a new technology. And you wanted the first mover to the extra spillover effects of learning by the first mover. But that was in the 1950s. Now we all know what fertilizer does, but somehow it's very difficult to get rid of that subsidy. But the solution that was discussed in this paper was not about going back and fixing the fertilizer subsidy. It was, let's take the fertilizer subsidy as given, and maybe for political and other reasons it's not going to be changed, and then let's see what we can do given that huge distortion, the macro distortion that Devesh was talking about. Let's see what we can do at the micro level to improve farmers' productivity by this soil health cards, is that what, and use of ICT as a way of informing farmers. Speaking of which, there's another underlying government failure there, which is the failure of the extension services. Right? I mean, agricultural extension services was also introduced as a way, the information has externalities, so we'll have these extension agents going out there and delivering information to farmers. And there was an explicit mention in the paper, as well as in the discussion, as well as in the literature, that those extension services just don't work. And they cost quite a lot. So now we're sort of, again, adding on another layer. We're taking those extension services and saying, let's forget about those. Let's use ICT. Let's let the smartphone be your extension service, and you get a video on your smartphone that supplants the failed extension services. Fair enough. Let's do the best we can in this environment, but let's also see what we can do to try to address those macro distortions, which is why we're in the soup in the first place. And there, I want to push the ICT angle, because the use of ICT seemed to be more in one direction, that is the cognoscenti giving information to farmers. But you could also use it in the other direction, having farmers actually give their opinions and their information back to the public, but indirectly back to the politicians. And try to build support for reform of these subsidies. If we can actually have the farmers realize that it was those subsidies that got them into this problem in the first place, then we might be able to bring some solutions. And then finally, 0 minutes left, the cities paper, I think, also has this tension between market failures and government failures, because in any discussion of cities, you have, on the one hand, a market failure, which is the agglomeration externalities associated with cities, and everyone is trying to capture those. But on the other hand, in India in particular, I think you have these huge government failures that we talked about already, the land and labor market regulations. And I think those seem to dominate whatever potential agglomeration externalities we might be able to get. I mean, if you look at, I remember back when I was the chief economist in South Asia, I was looking at rural-urban migration in India and comparing it to rural-urban migration in China. Well, in China, rural-urban migration was restricted. There was a law. You couldn't migrate more than a certain number of people. And in India, there were no laws against rural-urban migration. But yet, rural-urban migration in China, even with restrictions, was greater than in India, which was unrestricted. So there were other things going on that were actually stopping that kind of migration, and most of it had to do with these labor and land regulations. So there too, I think the policy implications of that paper, you have to look at it very carefully. Are we actually helping promote one of the agglomeration externalities, or are we helping to overcome those government failures that are standing in the way of city growth, real, genuine employment growth in cities? So just to conclude, I'd say that this market failure, government failure approach gives a common theme across all of these papers, these seemingly unrelated papers, and put some of these findings in perspective. But I would encourage all of us, in much as we celebrate the findings in these papers, to not forget the original problem, the elephant in the room that got us into this situation in the first place, and make sure that our solutions can actually help us overcome those big problems and certainly not exacerbate the government failures that are currently plaguing the economy at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Shanta. Thank you, Shanta, that's a very good beginning for this session. Our next speaker is Karthik. 15 minutes.
Is this on? Yeah, great. Thanks, Shanta. And this is, it's a new experimental idea for a session, but I think it works particularly well this year because we're teeing up Lent, and so I think it all comes together quite nicely. So since Shanta's already summarized the papers, let me just point to a couple of examples from the papers we saw in the past couple of days that point to the centrality of this issue. And it goes back to something Devesh said about what is, first order. So when in Rohini's paper, and that Anant, presented exceptionally well, you get all these great ideas about what to do. You even potentially get some ideas on how to do. But the moment you then get to who will do this, and will they do this anywhere close to how it should be done, that's kind of when we, kind of all bets are off. And there's a striking graph there, right, about the reported pollution in these plants. And if you look at what's reported and how nicely it's bunched under the activation threshold, where the penalties get activated, and then when you have the independent measure, there's completely no correlation, right? And so it's just that to me is almost like the most striking piece, not about the research, but about the facts about the environment we're operating in. Similarly with Sean's paper, I think, there was a lot of very interesting insights there. But to me, the biggest takeaway is just that, listen, as a country, we've committed to doing this stuff, and the correlation appears to be close to zero. And then we get the answer from one of the discussants saying that this is because these are done for free by agricultural universities and there's no skin in the game, they'll put whatever there is. And so, but it really does beg the question that the amount of resources that are being spent on essentially a foundation of sand, what are we doing, right? And so, I think what I thought I would do in my comments is, instead of just going back to the papers, summarize some recent themes in research that all speak to these themes of state capacity, and then eventually tee it over to land. I think, this sits very much at the intersection of a lot of my own work in the past 15 years in service delivery, and I think there's 4 broad themes that I want to highlight. The first is that implementation really, really matters, and for both policy and even academics, when you do program evaluation, you're often looking for exogenous variation in a program, without kind of recognizing that the program is very different as a function of how well it's implemented. So implementation is so first order that in India, I almost have a 10-to-1 rule, which I'm going to illustrate with 2 completely different examples. So the first is from NREGA, right, where the official focus is all on the wages and the fiscal outlays, but not so much on implementation. So the striking example here is the following, right, which is my co-authors, Paul and Sandeep, they did this paper on NREGA wages, I think around 2008, 2009, and they found that when the statutory wage was raised and the fiscal outlay was raised, the pass-through of that raise to the workers was basically zero, right? And that's because what was determining what the workers were paid in a way was the outside option. So you could raise the official outlay, but the pass-through was basically zero, right? In contrast, if you look at what we found in AP Smart Cards, where the intervention is purely focused on implementation, okay? There's no increase in fiscal outlay. So there's a zero increase in fiscal outlay, but a substantial increase in the wages received by the poor. And our ROI calculation there is about a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of the returns of reduced leakage relative to how much was spent on implementation. Completely different example from education. Okay, so we finished this paper on, there's the early teacher absence paper that we all know, and then we went and did a panel study where we went back in 2010. And that paper is called Fiscal Cost of Weak Governance, because there is just one line item of teacher absence that alone costs about 9 to 10,000 crores a year. This is at 2010 salaries. Okay, so now the point is not just to highlight that number, but then to think about how we spend our money. Because the most expensive component of the Right to Education Act was reducing class size by hiring more teachers to bring PTR, pupil-teacher ratio, down from 40 to 1 to 30 to 1. Okay? But what you care about is the effective PTR, which is PTR divided by 1 minus absence, correct? So there are two ways of increasing effective PTR, which is you hire more teachers or you improve governance and reduce absence. And again, we calculate that it's about 10 times more cost effective on the margin, to have invested in better governance than to increase spending across the board. Now, this is, I think, one thing where sometimes this government maybe doesn't get enough credit for, right? I mean, they get blamed for many things, rightly. But I think one thing that they don't get credit for is you could not increase the top line spending in social sectors, but still have a dramatic increase in the effective presence of a program by focusing on implementation capacity. So I think that's one piece of good news. Now, so implementation matters. So the second thing is, so then what drives implementation? And it's very boring, but the answer really is management quality. So we've got a lot of good work now from Bloom and Van Reenen looking at management practices and quality across countries, across sectors, across industries. And I think the big headline number that comes out of this is that A, management matters, and B, unambiguously, public sector management is worse, sector after sector after sector. So it's about one standard deviation or more below. The third point then from there, once management matters, is what part of management matters. And it turns out that by far the most important piece is personnel management, is what are you doing with your people? Are you hiring the right way, promoting the right way, paying the right way? And so, we've got now work from multiple sectors. So measuring public sector worker productivity is not easy, but a lot of the best evidence we have comes from education. And that's because you can map the teacher to the classroom, the test scores the kids came in with and what they leave with, so that gives you a measure of productivity in terms of effectiveness in teaching. The results are just striking. It's there in our work, it's there in Jishnu's work in Pakistan, is that there's basically zero correlation between the pay and productivity in the public sector. And whereas in the private schools, you see better management on two margins. One is that the level of pay is better as a function of your effectiveness in the classroom. And two, and even more important, is on the selection margin, is because when you have panel data, you see that the teachers with higher value add are more likely to remain in the sample in the private school in subsequent years, and the left tails are more likely to be let go. Okay, so management is mainly about personnel management, which is the thing that the government absolutely does the worst. And so that is then my kind of Exhibit 4. And Exhibit 4, in terms of how we get compensation in the public sector so wrong, is one of the most striking and depressing and scary papers I've written in the past 10 years. Comes from studying the impact of this reform in Indonesia, where the government doubled teacher salaries across the board. Double. Okay, the single most expensive education reform you can imagine. It increased education spending by about 7% of the budget. In present discounted terms, the cost of that policy was over 100% of GDP. And this was supported by the entire kind of traditional, education establishment, saying you pay more, you'll get better motivation, you'll get better effort, you'll get better outcomes. And, we go in there with this large-scale RCT, and you come back after 2 and 3 years, and the impact is exactly zero, right? And so that paper is called Double for Nothing. So, it's interesting in the context of the discussion that Neelkant was saying, that that the fiscal impact of pay commission will not be that much, but the way you want to think about this is the opportunity cost of what was crowded out by kind of incredibly ineffective spending. And in contrast, what you see is that our experiments in Andhra, and we're starting to see early results from Tamil Nadu as well, where we've been looking at different ways of performance pay in the public sector. And even with 3% of pay linked to performance, you get this huge increase relative to these across the board increases. Now, I recognize that it's very hard to do performance-based pay in the public sector, and so it does raise the question of, is all of this just proof of concept? Is it implementable at all? But I just want to, going back to what our first order questions, right? Like, I mean, point out the fact that the amount of time we spend on policy relative to how little time we spend talking about implementation capacity, that is just a first order misallocation, and that there would be benefits to both research and policy about just thinking about implementation as a first order issue, and then thinking about what pieces of state capacity then contribute to that capacity to implement. And, I'm hoping Lant will tell us more about this. Now, this is not to say that the private sector is the solution for everything. So one of the nice things that came out of the discussion yesterday is that the private sector, given a chance, will be just as unscrupulous, and the only thing worse than a public monopoly is a private monopoly, right? I mean, so, we had some, chilling presentations from Monica about how private insurance agents have absolutely no qualms about essentially selling you not just bad products, but selling you products that are basically stealing your money, okay? So, I think Manish Sabharwal said this best in an op-ed a couple of years ago, where he said the impossible trilemma of service delivery in India is that government has an execution deficit, private sector has a trust deficit, and civil society has a scale deficit, right? So, you've got the government has scale and legitimacy but can't execute to save its life. The private sector has scale and execution capacity. They can, you started getting bottled water in the rural kind of hinterland once Coke and Pepsi were distributing that along with their distribution chains. So they can execute at scale, but you have a trust deficit. And civil society usually kind of manages to get the right motivated people, and so is trusted for the most part and can execute but can't scale. And so given this kind of impossible trilemma, what do we do about service delivery? And so I think, my sense here, therefore, is from this research, what does that mean for us, both in terms of policy and research, is, I guess, three things. And this will tee up nicely, hopefully, the comments from the political representation, which is, the first is just recognize implementation constraints before making policy commitments. And this is certainly not something that seems to be on anybody's radar. In some ways, the courts are the worst offenders, right? Like, because, they can come in and proclaim without any concept of cost, but the executive is not that far behind as well. I mean, facetiously, sometimes I would summarize the rights regime that we had as kind of almost the goal was to get government as legislature to legislate beyond what government as executive could deliver, and then get government as judiciary to hold government as executive in contempt of government as legislature. Okay, so, and so this is my characterization of, broadly what we saw happening in the last 10 years, and you see how that ties you up in knots, because then you spend time in the typical principal secretary's office, and the amount of time he's spending responding to essentially various contempts because he's been asked to deliver more than he physically can. Okay. So it then gets us to the next point, which is, so when we say recognize implementation capacity before committing, this is another place where India is a historic outlier, and Indian exceptionalism is very real. So, there is a well-known cross-country fact that as countries get richer, governments get bigger, okay? Now, the traditional interpretation of this fact has been that as countries get richer, there's more demand for redistribution, and so you end up having this welfare state that needs to administer that, right? But there is also an economic efficiency argument for this, which is that as you get richer, as state capacity grows, the optimal amount of things the state should do will go up, right? So, and the converse of that is, where is India this historical outlier? Is, Arvind Subramaniam and I have talked about this in multiple settings. We all know that India is the only major country that democratized before development, and that has had many consequences. So one thing, of course, is the premature demand for redistribution relative to public goods, relative to the development trajectory of any OECD country. But there's a flip side of that, which is there's a demand for welfare and demand for redistribution before having developed the capacity of the state to deliver something according to that. So that then becomes, maybe it's an impossible question for politicians to turn down, because the voters expect you to do something, and how can you possibly say, no, we can't do something about this because our interference will make something worse? But the fact is that most of the time the interference does make something worse. And, in the agriculture session after that, we were talking with one of the discussants in the context of Devesh's paper from last year, and he was just giving example after example of how the agricultural crisis, so much of this is self-imposed with kind of knee-jerk short-term policy responses of export restrictions, when, so you're interfering with the market in an ad hoc way at every point, and that comes back and bites you in unimaginable ways, and you just don't know how to fix that problem. So I think the first thing is recognize implementation capacity. Second is recognize that very often, and going back to what Shanta was saying, that government intervention will make things worse and have the ability to explain that. And so this then goes back to, again, the first session yesterday about the role of economists. The role of economists is not just in gently killing the bad ideas. It is gently killing the bad ideas with a politically viable narrative for why, that is in fact the recommendation. So the economics is easy. It's threading through the political economy and the communication and the messaging that takes a lot more work, and I think we all can and should do a lot more on that. And the last, which will hopefully tee up land, is genuinely invest in state capacity, and this is something that I think has been remiss. Aadhaar is probably the only exception, of a major investment in state and implementation capacity that we've seen the past 10 years, and I think that's a good thing. But my sense is that state capacity is not just about systems, it's also very much about people. And at the top, you're starting to see a personnel policy that is putting a much bigger premium on integrity, which is a good thing. But at the lower levels of government, my sense is that the jobs are still seen primarily as providing patronage and jobs for the boys, as opposed to being the foundation of your service delivery regime for the next 30 years. So, we've been in an unnamed state, given how many projects we work on in so many states, one of our interventions in improving early childhood care, we've got a bunch of things on the plate, but one of them was hiring an extra worker so that you could have one worker focused on early childhood health and one on early childhood education. This was one of a menu of interventions, and we're doing all of this. But the only one that the minister was interested in was the one where there were 100 people to be hired, and instantly there were all these recommendation lists of people who had to be accommodated, and we had to push back. But the point is, this is for 100 people, and then when you think about what happens when you scale this up, is that the political impulse is essentially to see recruitment not as about service delivery, but as about patronage. And as long as we have that, I think you're in a very, very difficult place with regard to building state capacity for frontline service delivery. So on that optimistic note, let me just turn that over to Jay, and hopefully that tees up a bunch of ideas for land on low-hanging fruit and things we can do, and I'm perfectly in time.
Right. Thank you. Yes, and in fact, it's just a cue for Mr. Panda, because he's talking about implementation capacity and political issues. So this is the right time for you to take over.
Thank you. First, apologies for coming a little late. I was a last-minute addition to this panel, and I had taken the indulgence of the organizers because I was just coming in to town. I must clarify, I am not an economist. I, in fact, have a background in the private sector, but have been in Parliament now for 17 years. So I've seen both sides of the coin. I want to talk a little bit, not so much about the papers, because I've only just got a summary of them, but my own experience with the topic of market and government failures. I cannot emphasize enough that what we understand by markets and what the average Indian in rural India understands as markets is vastly different. The entrenched understanding in my rural constituency of markets is cronyism. The local contractor who gets to do all the construction bid out by the government or by the local public sector unit are the connected ones. It's not a level playing field. The person who gets to distribute the PDS, the agent, is obviously a political appointee. Even though there are efforts to reform all of that and bring in panchayats and others and bid it out. And of course, new innovations like Aadhaar and the JAM trilogy are making a big impact on that. But this is the traditional understanding. The economic reforms we've seen for the last quarter century, again, I wish to point out, throughout the 90s and until a few years ago, the reforms happened only because of crisis. Only when the government was left with no alternative but had its back to the wall. And even then it happened by stealth. In the governments throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, there were always a small group of people at the heads of the parties reporting to the Prime Minister who were trying to push through the reform agenda. It was never deeply accepted within the political system. It was compulsion and stealth. But by the late 90s, you started seeing some of the efforts kick in. And you started seeing celebration of entrepreneurship of a kind that had not been seen throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s. You would have thought that going into the 2000s, we would have a smooth continuation of the economic reforms. And that was not to be, because once again in the mid-2000s, you had all these major scandals, which again entrenched, not at the rural level, but for the Indian middle class, all over the country, that reforms meant cronyism. It was only in the 2014 national election campaign that any party publicly pitched economic reforms as one of the key campaign thrusts. If you remember, in 2014, the current Prime Minister campaign was minimum government, maximum governance. You'd had campaigns before on the price of onions, and you'd had the campaigns before on many other such issues, but nothing about streamlining governance, nothing about improving or reforming the economics of the country. This is not to say that the current government has met the standards that were expected. I think they've had a mixed track record, although I have very strongly supported them on the GST that has come through. It is far from perfect, but it is still nevertheless profoundly good. I want to make a point that this was preceded by a dozen or 15 years of regional level political leaders demonstrating that good economics could actually be good politics. You saw that in Gujarat itself, you saw that in Bihar, in Delhi for 3 terms, in Odisha, my home state. These were political leaders that were held up as examples of bringing in good governance, good economics to their states or their regions. And they broke the mold of anti-incumbency and went on to win 2, 3, even 4 terms. And I think that stage needed to be set for a national level change in mood. And let me give you an example of what is happening. Today, as you know, the cabinet has taken a decision to privatize Air India. Now, this may sound routine to many of us. It should have been an obvious policy consideration for years, if not decades. But I can tell you very bluntly that up until 3 or 4 years ago, it was anathema. It couldn't even be proposed by a government. If you look at the opposition to privatizing Air India today, you'll still see some. But what you are seeing today is just a sort of a whimpering sort of opposition from very few. And the reason for that is because we've reached a tipping point, because as the finance minister pointed out, 86% of civil aviation is already private. It has happened in a creeping sort of way over more than 2 decades. And until you reach a critical mass or a tipping point, the resistance to changing the established order is fierce. Now, I believe Air India privatization could have been proposed 5 years earlier, if not 10. But it would have taken much more political capital, much more political will. Today, there's barely a whimper of opposition to the idea being floated. It's another thing how it will happen and how the economics works out. I write monthly columns, and last year I wrote a column on exactly this issue of markets and government failures and the tendency of Indian governments to intervene in pricing mechanisms. The example at that point was 2 state governments had passed an ordinance to prevent surge pricing by Uber and by its Indian variants. And it's a popular kind of thing to say, but it had a fierce pushback within days, because if you stop surge pricing, what happens? Terrible shortage of taxis during peak hours. So the moment that the governments announced surge pricing is banned, there was a week of euphoria, even among the middle class, that, yay, this is a great thing. And in a week's time, that faded when they realized that they couldn't get cabs. And I wrote about this. But the inclination to intervene in pricing is very deeply set, and it goes back to the roots of how our republic was created, because the world has never seen such a big bang democracy created all at once. Every other democracy had decades or centuries of first land-owning males being allowed to vote, having stakes built into the system before others were allowed to vote. In our case, in one fell sweep, the electorate went from 5 million people to 300 million people. 5 million people were all that were eligible to vote in the proto-parliament pre-independence, when the British had started ceding some ground. So this obviously leads to huge amounts of populism, with a much more than larger focus than even other democracies on the urgent, on the immediate, without a focus on what will pay off in 5 or 7 or 10 years. That is beginning to change with the growth of the middle class, with the growth of the economy, with the opening up of the economy, with the new generation of Indians seeing what's happening in the rest of the world. We grew up without that information as to what is happening in the rest of the world. We had one black and white television channel and no internet. But unlike interference in surge pricing, there are other kinds of interference in pricing which doesn't have an immediate correction. Intervention in pharma pricing, for instance, is popular. It is not disruptive in the short to medium term. And look at other kinds of price intervention. You have cross subsidies, which I have experienced, for instance, electricity cross subsidies, where industries are made to pay much more so that farmers and domestic consumers could be subsidized, making industry non-competitive. I mean, this cross subsidy has gone to such a point in some states, including mine, where it makes certain obviously competitive industries in those places non-competitive. Take airlines or telecom. You have, in telecom, for instance, we have an USO fund, Universal Service Obligation Fund, so that those who don't want to operate in the remote areas because it's not profitable can simply focus on flying flights between Mumbai and Delhi and pay assess, so, which could be used to then underwrite operations in marginal places. But for more than a decade, billions of dollars collected through that was not utilized. It just sat in the Consolidated Fund of India in the big black hole where nobody saw what happened to it. This is a tremendous government failure, because the private sector and public sector entities who operated the airlines met their obligations. They paid their cess for not going into the remote areas. The government sat on that money. It's a good thing that in the last 2 years, a lot of that money has been deployed. We have enormous amounts of fiber optics being rolled out all over the country. In my rural constituency, fiber has reached every panchayat level. It doesn't mean everybody has internet yet, because that last mile of either Wi-Fi or something else is yet to happen, but it's a huge step that's been taken. It's a government failure. I want to conclude by saying, by citing 2 examples. Schools. We started a cess on education in 2004, and as a result, there has been tremendously increased funding for infrastructure of schools. And if you think of the old picture of rural Indian students being taught under a tree because they didn't have a schoolhouse, that's almost non-existent now. The actual infrastructure in rural India has improved tremendously, but the outcomes haven't. Any parent who can afford 50 rupees a month shifts his or her ward to a private school, either a small missionary school, or a school run by an NGO, or a school run by a small entrepreneur. Final example I want to give is a major shift that's taking place today at the panchayat level. Now, we have had for too long an over-centralized governance system where Delhi knows best has failed to deliver. And I cite the example that we had hundreds of union government-sponsored schemes which were cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all, which didn't work. For example, Kerala has 100% literacy. Orissa has the Indian average of 75%. We have vastly different requirements for primary education and secondary education. And yet, the funds available to us as a state were exactly the same. Take it, use it, don't take it, don't use it, doesn't matter. That has started changing after the 14th Finance Commission, because more block funds are going to the states. But it's not actually led to an increase because the union has started pruning some of its schemes. So net, the states are more or less getting the same amount of funds they were getting up until 2 or 3 years ago, except now they have more flexibility as to which silo they want to plow it into. One final thing that's happening is that panchayats, which are the village level elected lowest level of democracy, were always starved of funds, and that's changing in a very dramatic fashion. So up until 2 years ago, a panchayat in my constituency would get about 2 lakh rupees a year, roughly about $3,000 a year, serving several thousand citizens. And they couldn't even put up a street light, or maybe just one street light a year, let alone roads and classrooms and tube wells and all those other things. In just the last 2 years, there has been a dramatic upsurge, and panchayats are now beginning to get between 60 to 80 lakhs of rupees per annum. That's about $100,000. That's very dramatic. I expect it to lead to a surge in local corruption for the first few years, but I also expect it to lead to much better results a decade down the road, once the new devolution of money settles down, and once local voters become more engaged with demanding accountability from their local elected representatives and not just the MLAs and MPs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Panda. We have had a whole range of very important issues. I'm going to throw open the floor for discussion, but before that, let me say just for a couple of minutes about some supplemental issues. I have, throughout my professional life, worked largely in the area of market failure and government, particularly government failure. But at the moment, I'm not going to go into those larger substantive issues all the 3 speakers have brought up. But let me just mention supplementary couple of things. Both of these issues, at least in a tangential way, have come up in the discussion in yesterday and today. One is aspect of government failure, which we talk about rent-seeking, corruption, capture, and so on. But one much simpler aspect of government failure in India, which has come up occasionally in some of in the discussion of some of the papers, is that we just do not have a functioning government at all. For example, I remember in the pollution paper, there was a comparison, for example, for any given environmental protection agency, the number of officers per head of population in the United States and India, it's not anywhere near comparability. But that goes through the whole chain. The pollution came up in that paper, but police, judiciary, you name it, the number of vacancies. The question is, this is not today's problem. This goes on for a long time. So why is it that our size of our government is so small compared to the needs? And why do we persist with it? Is it just a fiscal failure? We cannot raise enough taxes to fund these functions? Or is there something else involved? I think this simple lack of government officials, of large number of vacancies, the whole bureaucracy, top to bottom, is just riddled with these vacancies. Unfilled, quite often goes unfilled for years. So that is an aspect of government failure which is a kind of supplementary to the obviously more substantive corruption, capture, rent-seeking, implementation capacity that Karthik talked about. So that is one aspect I just to throw in the pot of discussion. The other also arises out of something that Karthik touched on, the issue of trilemma. We talk about market failure, government failure, and I think Karthik very in passing talked about the civic society failure, but I think this is a larger issue. In the absence of a better name, I'd call it citizen failure. Quite often the citizen does not have the information, knowledge, which came out in the soil health paper. It came out in the financial inclusion when you talked about financial literacy. It came out there. So the citizen does not have enough information, knowledge, and therefore capacity to make even the nearby government accountable. And in fact, if you then aggregate from the individual citizen, I'd call it there's a community failure at the community level. Why is it so difficult to have community level cooperation in India, in different parts of India? So to me, this is the whole, in a sense, is a gradation of the same problem, but taking different forms: market failure, government failure, civic society failure, community failure, and going down to even individual citizen level failure. And all of these have has an implication for, so it's then goes beyond trilemma actually. And that's something I just want to again throw into the pot of the discussion, but I want to monopolize my time, the time that we have for discussion. So now the floor is open for discussion, questions, comments.
Ashok.
Shall we start from?
Ashok Lahiri in the back.
Oh, so maybe Ashok should have the priority because you are in the back.
Karthik has already mentioned about how the executive is legislating, the legislature and judiciary coming in and so on. It's yesterday's experience, and since I have got such a distinguished panelists here, I live in Haryana and I was going by NH8, the NH48 it's called, Jaipur Road. And I found a sign, 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers not allowed on the expressway. If you go by any Indian expressway, you will find there are 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. Now the question is, when you talk of government capacity, I know in most countries 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers are not allowed on highways. Should India set itself up for a government failure by having a law which it cannot implement? So what are your views on not allowing 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers on national highways?
It's quite a specific question, right? Okay, so you're going to collect questions, right?
I think the MP should answer that.
Sorry? The MP should answer. Anyway, we'll come back to the MP a little later. So let's collect some questions. So, yes, that end, Devesh.
Karthik in his comments had, I think, very correctly highlighted the importance of personnel policies in government. And there's that saying that personnel is policy. One of the interesting things is that the core constitutional bodies for recruitment of personnel in government, which is the UPSC at the federal level and the state public service commissions, it's interesting there's virtually no study or analysis of how they function. And I wanted to ask like Mr. Panda, if in his state he's aware of any study or any look at the State Public Service Commission. Do the exams they conduct, are they the right types of exams? Are the selection procedures, processes for the type of personnel that we believe should be recruited for what types of bodies in this day and age?
Thank you. Two comments. One, it's quite, looking around the room, one big government failure is complete absence of government representation in this India Policy Forum. So is that an IPF failure? Are we just happy talking to each other? Who are we saying talk about policy to? Or is it because they have no personnel to attend such meeting? Sorry? No, I'm not in government anymore, so forget about that. So, yeah, but anyway, today's policy, it's a serious point in the sense that the talking among ourselves very happily on a consistent basis on government failure, if one didn't know how India has been growing for the last 30 years, not 5, 10, 15, 20, but 30, listening to Shanta and Karthik, one would have thought this must be zero growth country. They're really terrible fellows, these Indians. We are like that only. So really on a serious note, I think that obviously we are all aware of so many issues that have been talked about, and there's no question of so many failures. But you still have to ask the question, if things were so bad, how is it that you have a 6.5% growth for 30 years, 35 years actually now, on average? And therefore I think that it is important for economists to discuss that, and then of course say obviously that look, if we had been better implementers, better policies, government implementation, etc., how much difference would it have made? What's the magnitude of the failure that we're talking about?
Thank you. It struck me that though this session was supposed to be about market failure and government failure, we have had three very eloquent, presentations on really government failure. We haven't talked at all about market failure, except for Shantayanan making that suggestion quite correctly, making the remark that in the environment pollution field, we mainly work through command and control instruments rather than fiscal instruments and so on. And everything you all said was absolutely accurate, but I was thinking, what sort of takeaways do you have from this? You can't have many takeaways on the market side because you all haven't really talked about it, except if I can again interpret Shantan to say that basically as far as the private sector is concerned, leave it alone. Now that leaves lots of gaps, and Rakesh, who just left, has this enormous report on infrastructure and so on, where you left it to the private sector to come up and make investments in infrastructure, and it didn't happen. So this government, this is after the 91 liberalism, they went back to rethinking this whole thing. So I think some amount of thought needs to be given to that. But apart from leaving private sector alone, the other very important points all made is about building state capacity, and I really like Karthik's focus on implementation, because I think any one of us who's spent any time trying to look at how things function, and I'm sure Jay will bear me out, is that is the cutting edge of the failures that we need to address. But anyway, I'd like your thoughts on this. I have a very specific question for you, Jay. And I was very pleased to hear from you that there's been a dramatic increase in funds flow to the panchayats. And I was waiting to hear from you perhaps what might be the reason for it. And I just want to ask you, because in the 14th Finance Commission, and Govind, two of us here were members of that, we had given a grant which was for financing local governments, both urban as well as rural panchayats, but it was linked to performance, and the performance that would trigger this would be audited account, because we didn't want money going there and flowing into a bottomless pit. So I've been very curious, waiting to see what has been the outcome of that particular recommendation. So I'd like to hear from you why you think these funds have been going up.
Now we're going to go this way. Rana.
Like the others, really enjoyed the comments. I was one issue that Karthik brought up. You were talking about Nick Bloom's various studies and the finding that personnel management really seems to be the key one. And as I recall from some of this work, this issue of tracking performance, which I guess is related to promotion, and there's this whole issue of hiring and then dismissal on the basis of non-performance. Now, just thinking about the public sector, I would suspect that public sector is everywhere. Dismissal is probably very difficult, regardless of the country. If you're working for the government, whether it's Thailand, Vietnam, I doubt if dismissal really is an option. It is in the private sector. So if we could unpack this a bit, what would you say is really the key? And I wonder if among the panelists, you would have experience of a number of different types of agencies. ISRO, for example, seems to perform its mission extremely well. So are there certain elements of the better performing agencies that can shed light on which aspect of personnel management are more or less important? Thanks.
Okay, I see two more. Shall we do those two and then go back to the panel? So yes.
So I had a small response to both what Shanta said and Karthik. You spoke about the importance of implementation, and certainly it's true that in the status quo, implementation and state capacity is often very weak. But the argument that we should somehow focus on implementation first and then sort of new ideas and big reforms second, I think misses an important point, which is that the status quo may be very bad at delivering good outcomes, but it's often very good at staying the status quo. And so when we talk about how you improve implementation capacity, perhaps one way of getting there is to say, let's set a new objective function. And in achieving that new objective function, we are going to be forced to put in the investments we need into institutions and people and human capital and other forms of capital in order to achieve that. And I think in some ways Aadhaar is a good example of that, because when this was proposed early on, the very similar arguments were made that we can't even implement what we already have. Let's fix that first before thinking of bold new ideas. But those investments have happened, and they've happened in response to an exogenous goal you set. So I just wanted to sort of think.
Thank you. Well, compliments to all the three speakers for bringing out some number of interesting issues. I'm actually reminded of the discussion that went on in Journal of Economic Perspective a few years ago, when Mrinal Dattatreya Chowdhury and Pranab were also a part of the discussion. And more importantly, there was a fascinating discussion between James Buchanan and Richard Musgrave in University of Munich. That symposium, week-long symposium, which was brought out as a book. And I think, that provides a real good understanding of what the problem is. And, in fact, two contrasting views on the state, the role of the state, one by Richard Musgrave and other by James Buchanan. Now, we did discuss about, I think it's natural that we should discuss more about government failure than market failure. The reason is market failure, we bring in government because there is a market failure. Otherwise, why would we need a government? So obviously the rationale for discussing government failure is that markets fail anyway, and therefore wherever they fail, the government has to come in. And now what is the solution? All the three of you have talked about this thing, but then the solution to this, the government failure, we still have to find. We don't really, there may be a number of things, but I think we need to really look for those solutions, whether the community, what sort of a community action has to be there, what sort of technology has to be brought in, and a variety of those issues will have to be brought in. And as Rakesh mentioned, quite a lot of the discussion, in a thing like this is bound to be sort of simplistic, in my view. The reason is that there are areas where the government has performed. There are areas, there was this mention that, sort of crisis is the mother of all reforms. Possibly the crisis led to quite a lot of reforms, and then that helped, particularly the service sector grow fast because the shackles on the service sector were much less than on the manufacturing sector. But then we did not really address those issues in the manufacturing sector. But within the government, if you see, there are two aspects to it. Generally we all think that the government is benevolent. Let us take that with a pinch of salt. more than that, there is an essential issue of government's inefficiency, and that is something which you can overcome either through larger number, more employees and things like that. But there is a malfeasance within the government. There is a special interest group activity. If you see that, why is it that today, why are we having the balance sheet crisis in both banks and the corporate sector? Is because there was a major government failure of whether it is in the allocation of natural resources, whether it is or the land acquisition for the highways, spectrum or coal. All these things have happened, and now we have ended up with a very serious situation, but we do not want to go back and clean it up. And when you clean it up, and then of course there is a major issue of nationalizing the banks, which basically do the lend money to whomever the political parties in power wants. There are issues of much more complicated issues of that nature. I think we need to address them in a much more careful. So how do we really deal with the special interest groups whenever the government comes into the picture?
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask the panelists, but probably in reverse order. So, Mr. Panda first.
The first question was, should the government impose rules that it cannot implement? But that's its core competence. It's like asking, should dogs bark? I agree with you that it shouldn't be the case. But I think it emanates from the rent-seeking impulse to have unreasonable rules in place, because that's how you extract rents. And then it becomes so unreasonable that it's totally impossible to implement. Any study of UPSC or state public sector, what kind of exams? I'm not aware of studies, but I'm aware of several attempts for administrative reform for many decades, which I'm sure you're aware. Some prime ministers have announced bold plans and have had to back down in the face of severe pushback from the steel frame. I believe the exams are not right. I believe the whole raison d'etre of the civil service, which is a 19th century animal, doesn't suit the purpose that a civil service should be designed for 21st century India. They're overburdened, they're mismatched. I believe there should be separate exams, because somebody who's trying to be a diplomat and ends up being a cop in the field has probably got very different inclinations. I believe there ought to be separate exams. I believe there ought to be mid-level evaluations and career focus areas, rather than being a generalist right up to the top. Something very interesting is happening now. This government has started doing things by stealth on this particular aspect. On some other aspects, the Prime Minister has taken a bold stand and has marketed GST politically and things like that. But on this one, something phenomenal has been happening. If you look at appointments in the government of Joint Secretary and above for the past 3 years, 50% of them are non-IAS. They're from other government services. It's not as radical as you might want it to be, but breaking that monopoly of a single service is going to have dramatic impact in the coming years. And if you have separate exams for the different services, I think that would be something very interesting. Also, they're putting in place, it was in yesterday's papers, you might want to go through it, a very drastic revision in the evaluation of civil servants. For the first time, you'll have 360 feedback from juniors as well. I think it's very, very good if they can stick to it and not have to roll back. Are things so bad, Rakesh, you asked? No, I don't think they're so bad. I think we've sort of reached a level of about 6 to 7% growth rate trajectory, which is normal for us. But I believe that by now, if we hadn't dropped the ball in the past few years, we should have reached somewhere closer to a 10% normal trajectory. And to that extent, I think we are only talking about the delta that should have happened and hasn't happened. I'm not at all a pessimist. If you see my opinions, I try to look at the glass both half full and half empty. And in any case, I often get mistaken for a government member of parliament, so maybe that serves the purpose as far as Shekhar is concerned. Sudipto asked about market failure. You're right, we did talk a little more about government failure. Let me give you two examples. One is real estate. In the past 2.5, 3 decades, the private real estate sector boomed, created many billionaires, created large number of affordable homes, and then went badly sour. They could have actually self-regulated and not had the courts intervene and not had a regulator put in place. I think they had the wherewithal to do that, but I think they got greedy. Another example is just in the recent 2 years, is coal blocks were bid out. And you've had tremendous failure because well-established companies have won bids and have not delivered. And one example of which I think combined market and government failure is the major scandals of 5-7 years ago were, of course, cronyism. But I see that as both a market and government failure because they were really well-established names that got sucked into that scandal. Whereas I would have hoped that some of those major AAA type companies should have stayed away from those tainted bids and taken a public stand that this is not workable. And that, I think, would have helped put the focus on having more transparent systems. Whereas they got sucked into it, that if everybody else is doing it, we might as well do it. Why are funds going up to Gram Panchayat level? Beats me, but I think it's a damn good thing. You know, some of us I've been pushing for it for 15 years. And the major resistance has come from MLAs. You see, at the union government level and MP level, we want to see the devolution happen. But at the state government level, which is dependent on MLAs, there is tremendous resistance because the MLAs don't want to see the Zilla Parishad members and the Panchayat Samiti members be able to deliver and grow up as political alternatives. So they've resisted it. I don't know why it has suddenly clicked. It's worth studying, but it's a good thing. And finally, ISRO, I think, is the exception that proves the rule. Even very ISRO-like organizations like DRDO, for instance, have failed very badly. If you look at why public sector employees can't be held accountable, it has to do with employment rules, it has to do with the buck not stopping anywhere, all kinds of issues. But I believe ISRO is the exception. It can't be used as an example for why other entities are not functioning well.
Thank you. Karthik, 3 minutes.
Yeah, there are lots of questions, but I'll take 30 seconds extra, Pranab, to answer your question. So, which is, no, I think, you started this question about vacancies, and my IPF paper last year, a lot of it was about that. And I think the distortions in the public sector labor markets, a big part of it comes from the fact that the salaries are just too high. So, when you have salaries that are that high, you can tell it's high when you have 500 applicants for every opening, right? So there's no fiscal space to hire, so you're in this squeeze where you pay too much and you have too few people. And my whole paper talks about structures of reforming that. So I think, so Rakesh, I think Jay already got to the point. I mean, yes, I'm also an optimist, right? I mean, in this business, but having worked in service delivery for 15 years, I can't help just think about how much better we could do if that was something that we put our mind to. And coming to personnel, I think, thinking about China, there's many, many reasons why they grew at 9.5% versus 6.5%. But, I think Pranab himself has done work on this. But one of the really important parts of China that's underappreciated is how much there are career incentives for people to deliver at lower levels of government in a way that we simply don't have, right? So promotion prospects for local party officials are very much a function of economic growth delivered in those areas. Now, that has some downsides in terms of pollution, and they fudge their pollution data and stuff like that. But fundamentally, getting the incentives right, really matters, and that's something which we've not done at multiple levels, and that's worth reflecting on. So I think the personnel piece, but you're right to ask for the perspective, and I think it's in the spirit of Devesh's question, which is, are we spending our time on something that's, completely third order, or if we did the math right, would this contribute to another percentage point of growth? And I think, both health and education are places where we have evidence to think, at least from cross-country growth accounting type perspectives, that these things really do matter. So I think, Sudipto, yes, again, on markets, in fact, the reason I think we didn't talk enough about markets was precisely because we assume market failures, the existence of market failures, enough reason for government to go in there. And so part of the goal of shedding light on government failures is to then hopefully recalibrate the equilibrium and have government step back and think more creatively about markets as ways of delivering solutions. So Rana, you raise a very good point, and I think it ties up to a larger point about public sector state capacity. Maybe Lant will talk about this too, which is, I think there's two problems. One is that you can't fire anybody. And the second is that when you hire in the civil service, you kind of expect the job to be there for 35 years, whereas there's no reason to think that the job itself will not change. And we saw this in the context of the environment discussion that, I think Anant was saying that based on the policies they chose for SOX regulation in the US, the number of people needed fell very sharply. So if you had hired 200 SOX inspectors, and you'd moved to a regime where you needed 4, then you'd be stuck. So I think there's a more general case for thinking about 5-year contracts as kind of being the right model for different categories of government employment going forward, where the jobs are defined and these are renewable. So both in terms of the accountability and in terms of the talent pool and in terms of being able to phase out jobs that are not needed anymore. So, it's been a Herculean task for this government under Bibek Debroy to even start scrapping some completely obsolete laws. But these things, once they're on the books, they're very hard to take out. And the last point, I think, Anant, so I think you're absolutely right. I think my point was just one of relative emphasis, which is both in academia and policy. We get excited about policy, whereas implementation is just seen, once you've done your policy design, implementation is, that's somebody else's job, right? And I think the point I was just trying to make in all of these things is that improving implementation is perhaps, many orders of magnitude more important than the policy. And so I'm completely with you that the way you create capacity is perhaps not, and it ties with something Arvind Subramaniam said and also something Jay said in a different context, which is that the way you reform in India is not by phasing out the bad, but by reducing its market share, by allowing entry of the good. So that over time, the bad is just a lesser part of the overall problem. So, and that's relevant in the context of the Air India conversation, right? So you didn't privatize it, but you allowed the good guys in, and over time, this became a lesser and lesser thing, and then you were able to get rid of it. So, and perhaps the same thing will apply in the context of state capacity. Right? We built Aadhaar essentially by bringing in outsiders, around a project with a leader, who could both integrate with government and get the talent needed to do that. And maybe with pollution, maybe we say, here are some absolutely core functions that the state needs to deliver, but needs to deliver in a different radical way. So let's create an organization that will do it and allow it to staff with some of these newer structures that will allow us to do that. So you don't get rid of the existing status quo, but as the need of what the state needs to do expands, if you kind of crowd in the good, you kind of shrink the market share of stuff that's not so good. So,
okay, yes, 3 minutes. Thanks. No, I think Karthik answered most of the questions I was going to. Let me just make a few quick points. Rakesh, the 6% growth, average growth is 6.5. Sorry, is fine. But just keep in mind that it has not been accompanied by rapid employment growth, productive employment growth, and it's falling way short on human capital formation. And those two are essential for the future. So I guess let's put that in perspective. So Sudipto, I mean, we have to be very clear when we talk about market failure. What we talk about market failure, that's the existence of a public good or an externality, or there is some kind of redistribution rationale. Those are the reasons for government intervention. It doesn't mean that markets don't just screw up all the time. I mean, they do all the time. That's not market failure. Market failure is a very specific term. And it's not clear that the experience of leaving everything to the market, as in the infrastructure case, is evidence of market failure. Indeed, I would say that the reason why the private sector did not come in on infrastructure was because the infrastructure sector in India is heavily with government intervention. You have all these subsidies, you have all these regulations, you have all these controls. In that situation, it was not exactly inviting to the private sector. And in fact, many private sector people didn't believe that those subsidies were sustainable. They were right, by the way, in which case it didn't pay for them to actually intervene. So we didn't really leave it to the market. We just sort of withdrew with some other sort of, which was politically easy. Rana, I think important point about civil service incentive, I think, is the way I would put your question, because we do talk a lot about incentives in terms of monetary rewards and everything else, but you think about the Swedish civil service. They don't get paid very much either, and yet everybody shows up to work and they actually do their job. There is something called norms, shared norms. And that is what keeps the Swedish civil servants from shirking. The tricky thing is, how do you get from one set of norms, which frankly we have here, where it's okay for you to be absent from your job. Indeed, some people think it's a prestigious thing to do, to one where it's a norm that you don't shirk from your job. I think that's the challenge. And maybe we have, in the past, certainly I have, overemphasized the monetary incentive, but it really is a way of trying to shift those norms.
Thank you. Shekhar, we are right on dot at 3:30. And as you know, I have to rush to the airport, but if you want to continue, you decide.
No, I think we've had a very good discussion. It's really been very rich, and I'm glad that we've tried this innovation. So I just want to thank the three panelists and Pranab for what's been a really incredibly rich and also reflective discussion that goes back to the papers that we've had. So this is actually then the formal end of the India Policy Forum for this part of the conference. We still have the India Policy Forum lecture, which is always the highlight, and Lant is here. So that's at 7 o'clock, with registration starting at 6:30 at the Imperial Hotel. There'll be transport from here or from your hotels to Imperial. And so I hope to see at least all of you, and there'll be many more people, I'm sure, at the lecture. Karthik, you want to say a few things about the IPF and the way things are going, and then I need to thank a whole bunch of people. So why don't you, as my co-editor, say a few words. I know that Pranab has a flight to catch. So, Pranab, we're going to excuse you, and if you have to leave, you have to leave. But thank you so much.
No, so I won't take more than 30 seconds, except to say that the IPF is an evolving entity. It's had fantastic history, and we constantly strive to be more relevant, more rigorous, and more impactful. So I think one thing we will do is put out calls. We want to make the paper process a little bit more kind of just open and transparent. And so in the past, we've had to kind of just invite people just to make sure that we are kind of having people with the right expertise to cover the right topics. But we want to put out a call and make this open, and we'll put that out quickly. So please help us kind of both source and distribute that. And other than that, I don't think there's anything else very concrete. But we will constantly be in touch and look for ways of improving how we're doing things. But thanks again for the authors. I thought we had a great conference.
So I have a whole bunch of people to thank, and then we'll do the clapping. First of all, we need to thank our supporters, our corporate supporters. They're all listed there: HDFC, Reliance, IDFC, Citi, and Sage. So we are very grateful to them. It's the best kind of hands-off support that they give, and we benefit greatly from that. NCAER bears the brunt of doing the work, though some of it is shared in the editing by Barry Bosworth and Karthik. And I want to thank my colleagues at NCAER who really kind of sweat day and night towards the end to make this happen. And so I think some of them are in the room, and I hope they will just come in. But I want to thank Akansha Dubey, who's my special assistant at the back, who's done a lot of work. Devarajan, can we have some of the other people come? Sudesh Bala, who is my executive assistant, does a lot of the work for this, and you talk to her all the time. Anupma Mehta, who does a lot of assistance on the editing of the journal. Jagbir Singh Punya at NCAER, who's our publications in charge. Sangeeta Chaudhary, who's also our team assistant in the group. PP Joshi, who deals with all of you who have hotels and who get picked up at the airport. And then the IT person who makes many of these things happen is Praveen Sachdeva, who's right there in the back. So can we give them a big round of applause? And finally, I just want to thank Karthik and in absentia Barry for being fellow travelers and really, and particularly to Karthik for bringing in a lot of fresh ideas and new initiatives, and that's part of the process that we look forward to. Again, thank you all for coming. We'll see you in the evening at 6:30 around then, and we'll start at 7 at the Imperial Hotel. Good afternoon.
Great.